Welcome to my channel. This is Teacher Charles. In this video, we will look at how to answer A-levels or AS level History Paper 1. Hopefully, with this information, you will be able to score higher in your upcoming exams. So, let's begin. Let's first look at the content of this video presentation. We will focus on the syllabus 9489 AS History endorsed by Cambridge International Exams. The AS syllabus consists of both Paper 1 and Paper 2. In this video, we will only look at Paper 1. We will also look at the exam question format, then followed by how to answer Paper 1, Part A and Part B to reach the maximum scores in the higher level. In the CIE syllabus, there are three options for Paper 1. There are the European option, the American option, and the international option. Depending on the school, the students are taught the respective option. Regardless of whichever option, the students are only required to answer one from one of the options. Next, we will look at the question format of Paper 1. The duration of the paper is 1 hour and 15 minutes. This is the time you are required to answer only one question from one option. The total mark is 40. Each question is then divided into Part A and Part B. Part A is 15 marks and Part B is 25 marks. Paper 1 assesses the student in document study. In another word, it is source-based questions. There are 4 sources given per question. The sources can be from newspaper articles, past speeches, political cartoons, and even photographs. Next, we will look at the answering technique. Let's go through the different steps of answering Part A. The first step is to read the question Part A, not the sources yet, so that you can focus on what the question is asking when you read the sources later. And read only the 2 sources mentioned in Part A. Be careful which 2 sources, as different questions are different. There are source A and B, sources B and C, or sources A and D, etc. So be careful to double check which 2 sources the question Part A is asking. The question usually use some of the following keywords. The keywords can be compare and contrast. To what extent do the sources agree about? In another word, the question is basically asking about the similarities and differences between the 2 sources. Step 2 is to find the similarities. You can start the essay with a quick introduction, or you can straight away mention the similarities between the 2 sources. When you mention the similarities, make sure you focus on what the question is asking, rather than random similarities. You must also include quotes from the sources to support your answer. You will need to write at least 2 similarities between the 2 sources. After you have done that, it's time to look at the differences. The method is similar to what you have done for similarities. Now you have to do the same for differences between the 2 sources. Again, make sure you focus on what the question is asking, and also include quotes from the sources to support your answer. The final step for answering Part A is source evaluation. You are required to summarize the similarities and differences by evaluating the two sources, such as what the context is, what are the sources about, the origin, when were they written, was it before or after a major historical event, who was the intended audience, what was the motive behind the sources, why were they written, are the sources valid or reliable, was it a primary source or was it a secondary source, etc. Before we move on to part B, here is the quick summary on the steps of answering part A. Make sure you read the correct two sources, then look at the similarities and then the differences. Remember to quote from the sources to support the answer. Lastly is to evaluate the sources. Now, let's move on to how to answer part B. In part B, you are required to look at all the four sources. I always advise my students to read the question and start by looking at the two sources that you have read in part A. In this way, you will save time because you are already familiar and understand the first two sources from part A. But now you are just focusing by looking at these first two sources from another angle as required in the question part B. This will save you time. After that, only then you read the other two sources. While going through the sources, work out which sources support and which ones challenge the statement as mentioned or asked in question part B. The keywords used in part B are usually how far do the sources support this view, how far do these sources agree, to what extent do these sources agree. Basically, the students are required to assess all the four sources. Start your essay by summarizing which sources support and which challenge the view. As this is in the introduction, you don't have to give much evidence just yet. Why do you have to do this now? It's because if you run out of time in the conclusion part later, at least the examiner would know that you have come to the conclusion or judgment. This might bring you to a higher level in the mark scheme. Next is to start by assessing source A. Mention if source A supports or challenges the view. Remember to quote from source A to provide the evidence to support your findings. Before moving on to source B, you need to evaluate source A. Evaluating is look at the context and the origin of the source, the validity, the motive of the writer in reference to the view asked in the question. Only after this, then you can move on to source B. Now do the same what you have done in source A on source B. Support or challenge the view. Quote from source B. Evaluate source B. Then do exactly the same for sources C and D. Support or challenge. Quotes. Evaluate. Lastly, in the conclusion part, mention which sources support and which sources challenge the view, like what you did in the introduction. However, in the judgment part, you can now also mention out of the four sources, which source best supports the view asked in the question part B. Give the reasons why that is the source that best supports, and don't forget to quote if necessary. So this is the step-by-step guide to answer part B. First step is to read the questions, then the sources. Start by summarizing which sources support and which sources challenge in the introduction, followed by assessing source A, support or challenge, quotes, evaluation. Do exactly the same for sources B, C, and D. Then in conclusion, mention which source best supports the view and why. That's all for this video presentation on how to answer AS or A-Level History Paper 1 source-based questions. If you have any queries, you are free to leave your questions in the comment section below. Feedback is most welcome in order for me to improve my tutorial videos. Thank you and good luck in your exams. Bye for now.